welcome back. Tonight, we explore the darkest, strangest, and most unsettling facts about the Umbrella Corporation, the company that built a pharmaceutical empire on the bones of its own experiments and left the world permanently changed by the time it fell. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight and what games you want me to cover next. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a dream. The real purpose, hidden behind the logo. Most people who lived in the world of Resident Evil would have recognized the Umbrella Corporation the same way we recognize household names today. The logo on the side of a medicine bottle, a familiar slogan heard on the radio, a brand that felt woven into the fabric of daily life. Umbrella sold aspirin. It sold skincare cream. It made the ointment sitting in your bathroom cabinet. It sponsored city revitalization projects and funded hospitals. On paper, Umbrella Corporation was exactly what its motto claimed, a company dedicated to preserving the health of the people. But the men who built it never cared about health. They cared about something far older and far more dangerous than any virus. They cared about eugenics. The corporation was, from its very first day, a machine built to pursue a single goal: the forced evolution of the human species under the control of the men who believed themselves worthy of deciding what humanity should become. Every product sold, every research facility funded, every government official placed on the payroll. All of it existed to finance that one ambition. It was one of the most successful deceptions in recorded history, and it ran for over 3 decades before the world began to understand what had been happening beneath the surface. 3 men and a shared obsession. The Umbrella Corporation did not begin with a board meeting or a business plan. It began with 3 men who met as university students and discovered they shared a belief that most people in polite society had long since learned to keep quiet. Oswell E. Spencer, the Earl Spencer, was a British aristocrat of considerable wealth and a deeply misanthropic worldview. A man who had lived through the Second World War and the Cold War and come away from both convinced that humanity, left to its own devices, was heading toward ruin. He believed the only way to save the species was to replace it with something better. Dr. Edward Ashford, the 5th Earl Ashford, was a fellow British nobleman and a respected virologist who had already been investigating whether a mutagenic virus might be capable of promoting accelerated evolution. And Dr. James Marcus was a prominent virologist who had first crossed paths with Spencer in their school years and had since spent considerable time studying paleobiology at a Swiss university. These 3 men, each brilliant in his own way, each convinced that the world needed to be remade, formed the core of what would eventually become the most dangerous corporation in history. They did not start as enemies of civilization. They started as idealists. That, perhaps, is the most unsettling part. The flower that started everything. Long before Umbrella Pharmaceuticals was incorporated, before the first laboratory was built, before a single test subject was ever harmed, there was a flower. Spencer had read about it in a document called the Natural History Conspectus, written over a century earlier by a man named Henry Travis, a documented account of African folklore describing a bloom that granted extraordinary abilities to those who consumed it. The flower was called the Stairway of the Sun, and it grew in West Africa in a region cultivated by an indigenous people known as the Ndapaya. The Ndapaya had known about this flower for generations. They consumed small doses of it as part of their culture, and there were accounts within They're oral traditions of individuals who had developed remarkable physical abilities as a result. Spencer tracked these accounts, cross-referenced them with Ashford's own research into mutagenic viruses, and eventually convinced his colleagues that what the Ndipaya were cultivating was not simply a plant. It was the natural host of something ancient and powerful. In the mid-1960s, the three men and Marcus's protege Brandon Bailey mounted an expedition to West Africa to find the flower for themselves. Sources vary slightly on the exact year. Some place the initial expedition in 1966, while the progenitor virus's documented discovery date in the franchise's canon records is listed as December 4th, 1967. But the outcome is agreed upon. The Stairway of the Sun was found in the Ndipaya's underground garden, and the virus within it was confirmed. What they found there would ultimately lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. What was done to the Ndipaya? When Spencer, Marcus, Bailey, and associated researchers arrived in the region where the Stairway of the Sun grew, they encountered a civilization that had existed in harmony with this unusual flora for longer than Western science had even begun to document viruses. The Ndipaya were not a group of helpless villagers. They were a people with deep cultural knowledge of the land and the bloom that sustained them. Their exposure to low doses of what Spencer's team would eventually call the progenitor virus had, over generations, produced individuals of exceptional physical capability. Some accounts describe the Ndipaya warriors as possessing heightened endurance and resilience that clearly exceeded ordinary human limits. Spencer was not moved by this. He saw resources, not people. Following the initial discovery of the virus in the Ndipaya's underground garden, the Garden of the Sun, Spencer returned not with fellow researchers but with mercenaries, specifically hired to force the Ndipaya off their land entirely. The tribe was systematically displaced from the Sun Garden, their connection to the flowers severed, so that Umbrella could establish an exclusive research base on the land. The Ndipaya did not leave willingly. They were pushed out of a home they had cultivated for generations, their knowledge extracted without credit, so that Spencer and his company could build laboratories where their sacred ground had stood. Beneath those mountains, Umbrella would eventually construct one of its most deeply concealed facilities, a place that would not be rediscovered for decades, even as the displacement that enabled it left the Ndipaya with nowhere else to go. The company takes shape. With samples of the progenitor virus in hand, the three founders faced an immediate problem. The virus could not survive outside its natural African environment. The cultivation conditions required to keep progenitor viable were extraordinarily specific, involving the right temperature, humidity, and biological medium that only existed in the region where the Stairway of the Sun grew. This meant that before any research could begin in earnest, Umbrella needed significant resources to recreate those conditions in other locations, and resources required a legitimate front. In April 1968, Umbrella Pharmaceuticals was formally established. Spencer poured a substantial portion of his own personal fortune into the enterprise. The company was based initially in Raccoon City, a mid-sized Midwestern American city that would, over the following decades, become almost entirely dependent on Umbrella's presence, though the main parent company headquarters were quickly moved to Berlin, Germany. A pharmaceutical company needed pharmaceutical products, and Umbrella provided them, manufacturing drugs, ointments, and consumer goods that were genuinely useful and genuinely popular. This legitimacy was not an accident or an afterthought. It was the foundation of the entire deception. Every aspirin tablet and every tube of Aquacure that reached a consumer's hands made it slightly harder for anyone to imagine that the same company was running underground laboratories where people were being injected with experimental pathogens. The mansion built on secrets. Among Spencer's earliest and most significant investments was the construction of a private estate in the Arklay Mountains, a forested range several miles northwest of Raccoon City. To the outside world, this was simply Spencer's mansion, an eccentric aristocrat's private residence, remote and elaborate, the kind of property that wealthy men sometimes acquired simply because they could. What the outside world did not know was that the estate had been designed from the beginning with a hidden purpose. Beneath the mansion, stretching deep into the mountain rock, was a fully equipped bioweapons research laboratory, the Arklay Laboratory, concealed behind the facade of a Gothic home filled with elaborate puzzles and traps. Spencer, paranoid even then about the possibility of intrusion, had the mansion designed to be deliberately difficult to navigate for anyone who did not know its secrets. Winding corridors led to dead ends. Rooms required specific keys to access. There were mechanisms built into the architecture that could seal or destroy sections of the building entirely. The facility underneath was capable of housing researchers, experimental subjects, and fully grown biological weapons simultaneously. And when construction was complete and the building stood finished, Spencer did something that revealed exactly what kind of man he was. The mansion's architect was a New York designer named George Trevor, whose firm Trevor and Chamberlain had been hired specifically to realize an elaborate and secretive commission. When the work was done and Spencer had what he wanted, Trevor became a liability. Someone who knew the full layout, the hidden passages, the concealed mechanisms, the secret access to the laboratory below. Spencer invited the Trevor family to stay at the estate, then had George imprisoned inside the very structure he had designed, locked in a hidden chamber to die slowly, his knowledge of the mansion's secrets secured in the most permanent way possible. Trevor's wife Jessica and their daughter Lisa were taken directly to the underground laboratory and injected with progenitor virus strains as test subjects. George died alone inside the walls of his own architectural masterpiece. It was one of Spencer's earliest and most complete demonstrations of his operating philosophy. Use people for precisely what they offer, and then ensure they cannot speak about what they saw. The pledge that said everything. Inside Umbrella's walls, the real walls, not the pharmaceutical facades, there was a motto that employees in the corporation's inner circles were expected to live by. It was stated clearly in James Marcus's records and was treated as something close to a sacred text for those who understood Umbrella's true goals. It read, "Obedience breeds discipline. Discipline breeds unity. Unity breeds power. Power is life." 5 short sentences that laid out a corporate philosophy indistinguishable from the internal doctrine of a totalitarian state. Obedience first, always obedience, and from obedience everything else followed. Discipline, unity, power, and finally life itself as the ultimate reward for compliance. The motto was not something that appeared in any of Umbrella's public-facing materials. It was not printed on the packaging of Safsprin aspirin tablets or featured in the annual pharmaceutical report. It was the language of an organization that saw its own employees as resources to be shaped, directed, and, when necessary, eliminated. Spencer had taken the language of eugenics, the belief that human beings could be improved through selection and control, and built a corporate culture around it. Even the people working inside Umbrella, who had no idea about the bioweapons or the viral research, were participants in a system designed to reward those who did not ask questions. the Many Faces umbrella showed the world. Public-facing umbrella was, by any reasonable measure, a remarkable company. Its pharmaceutical division produced products that were genuinely effective and widely trusted. Adravil was a pace-based pain reliever with broad consumer appeal. Its motto, quick and easy relief, appearing in advertisements that looked no different from anything a real pharmaceutical company might run. Safsprin was an aspirin-based brand with the tagline, "The Common Cure." Aquacure was perhaps Umbrella's most celebrated product, an ointment for open wounds that made the company famous worldwide, praised by medical professionals and household consumers alike. There were also consumer goods, food products, industrial machinery, transportation services, and even a tourism division. All of them real functioning subsidiaries that generated actual revenue and employed actual workers who had no idea what their salaries were funding. Umbrella also manufactured weapons openly sold to legitimate buyers, custom firearms, incinerator units, anti-tank rifles, none of which required any concealment because arms manufacturing was a legal industry. The genius of the entire construction was that Umbrella's illegal work was buried so deeply beneath legitimate enterprise that even a thorough investigation of the company's finances would have produced mountains of unremarkable pharmaceutical revenue before encountering anything unusual. The darkness was always underneath something real. The death that cleared the path. Edward Ashford was the most cautious of Umbrella's three founders. Where Spencer dreamed in sweeping megalomaniacal strokes and Marcus obsessed over his laboratory work, Ashford had been working independently on his own prototype T-virus, strand at his family's Antarctic laboratory, alongside his son Alexander. In July 1968, the same year Umbrella Pharmaceuticals was founded, Ashford died. The official account was a laboratory accident, exposure to his own prototype T-virus strain, the kind of fatal mishap that the early years of viral research could plausibly produce. The wiki is clear that the accident is believed to have been masterminded by Spencer, though the exact nature of Spencer's role and his precise motivation are never fully confirmed in the game's primary documentation. What we can infer from the broader shape of Spencer's behavior, his willingness to eliminate anyone who posed a risk to his control, his habit of staging accidents rather than overt violence, is that the convenient timing of Ashford's death, at the precise moment when Umbrella was being formalized and control of the corporation was being established, fits a pattern. With Ashford gone, his family's stake in Umbrella passed to his son Alexander, a man trained in genetics rather than virology, and consequently far less capable of challenging Spencer's direction for the research. Spencer's control over the corporation's future became effectively absolute. It was, based on what we know of how Spencer operated, likely the first time he used Umbrella's infrastructure as a weapon against one of its own founders. It would not be the last. Aquacure and the herbs of Raccoon City. Of all the products Umbrella sold to the public, Aquacure holds a particular place in the franchise's lore, not just because it was the company's most celebrated achievement, but because of an almost hidden detail that Rebecca Chambers once noted during her time at the Spencer Mansion. Aquacure, like many of Umbrella's pharmaceutical products, was described as being homegrown in Raccoon City. At first glance, this seems like a simple marketing claim. Local sourcing, community investment, the kind of language consumer brands use to appear rooted and trustworthy. But when you examine Umbrella's research facilities closely, something stranger emerges. The herbs found throughout Umbrella's various facilities, including those at the Antarctic base, thousands of miles from Raccoon City, were all traceable back to Raccoon City's cultivation. This strongly implies that Umbrella had been systematically growing and distributing these herbs through its pharmaceutical operations, using the legitimacy of Aquacure and its related products as a delivery and cultivation system. The herbs were real, the healing properties were real, but the infrastructure behind them was the same infrastructure that shipped bioweapons and test subjects across the globe. Aquacure was, in a sense, the friendly face on a supply chain that served purposes no one buying a tube of ointment at a pharmacy would have wanted to contemplate. A city owned by one company. By 1998, Umbrella employed approximately 30% of Raccoon City's population. That number, standing alone, already describes a relationship between a corporation and a community that goes far beyond typical economic influence. But the depth of Umbrella's control over Raccoon City went considerably further than employment figures. The company had funded the construction of the city's subway system. It had contributed to the renovation of City Hall and the construction of a modern hospital. Mayor Michael Warren's celebrated urban renewal initiative, the Bright Raccoon 21 Plan, was bankrolled in substantial part by Umbrella funds, giving the corporation leverage over the city government that Warren could not have refused even if he had wanted to. Umbrella had a controlling stake in sections of the city's sewer network. It had placed cooperators in the police department at the highest levels. By the time the events of 1998 unfolded, virtually every significant institution in Raccoon City, government, law enforcement, infrastructure, healthcare, had been touched and shaped by Umbrella's influence. The city was not simply a location where Umbrella did business. It was a resource, a testing ground, a population of unknowing subjects living inside what was effectively a company town, whose streets and water supply and civic life had all been arranged for the convenience of people who saw them as experimental variables rather than neighbors. Headquarters in Berlin, hidden in plain sight, while Raccoon City served as Umbrella's American operational heart, home to its most significant research facilities, its corrupted law enforcement, and a civilian population that provided cover and test subjects. The true corporate headquarters of the Umbrella Corporation was not in America at all. The parent company's main offices were established in Berlin, Germany, placing the central administration of one of the world's most dangerous organizations in one of the most closely watched cities in the Western world during the Cold War era. There is something quietly chilling about this. Berlin, in the latter half of the 20th century, was a city defined by the politics of surveillance, secrecy, and the contest between competing ideologies of control. It was a city that had already seen what happened when the language of eugenics and human improvement was granted governmental power. And in the middle of all of that, Umbrella set up its headquarters and ran a pharmaceutical empire whose secret purpose was to do precisely what the worst governments of the century before had attempted: to select, improve, and ultimately replace the human population with something its architects deemed more worthy. The irony, if it can be called that, is that Umbrella managed to do this while attracting almost none of the scrutiny that would have immediately been directed at any government attempting the same thing. Spencer and the Weight of the 20th Century. There is a line in the lore of Resident Evil that serves as one of the more quietly devastating pieces of character background for Oswell E. Spencer. It states that living through the horrors of the Second World War and the Cold War broke something in him. That despair was the foundational emotion driving all of his ambitions. This is not an excuse. Spencer was not a sympathetic figure who was simply warped by circumstance, but it adds a dimension to his villainy that makes it resonate in a way that pure cartoon evil never quite does. He looked at the 20th century, its genocides, its nuclear standoffs, its willingness to use human beings as instruments of political and military competition, and he did not conclude that humanity needed to be treated with more care. He concluded that humanity, in its current form, was simply not good enough. The species was degraded. It needed to be replaced by something superior. Spencer's eugenics beliefs were not unusual in the early 20th century. They were widespread, academically respectable, and catastrophically influential. What made Spencer unusual was that he had both the resources and the ruthlessness to actually attempt to act on them, and that he chose to do so through a pharmaceutical company rather than a government, which meant he operated for decades without anyone in a position of power deciding he was the kind of threat worth stopping. The laboratory beneath the ruins, the Africa Laboratory, the facility umbrella constructed in the region from which the Ndipaya had been displaced, was one of the corporation's most carefully concealed operations. Built beneath the ruins of the ancient Ndipaya kingdom itself, the laboratory was known to only two groups of people in the world: a small number of Umbrella's highest-ranking researchers and the remaining Ndipaya, who had nowhere else to go and whose knowledge of the area made them impossible to fully exclude. The facility's purpose was specific and critical. It cultivated the progenitor virus in its natural environment, the only place where the stairway of the sunflowers could grow and the only place where the virus existed in a stable, extractable form, and shipped refined samples to Umbrella's other research sites around the world. Every T-virus experiment in the Arklay Mountains, every bioweapon tested in the corporation's various facilities, was ultimately traceable back to the original stock maintained in this underground laboratory beneath a mountain range in Africa. The facility operated in secret for decades. When the events of 1998 began to unravel Umbrella's operations, Spencer ordered the Africa Laboratory shut down in November of that year, and then ordered its staff killed to prevent any of them from speaking about what had been stored and cultivated there. A researcher named Brandon Bailey was among those who died in the purge. He had spent years in that laboratory, maintaining the source of everything. The Bioweapons Treaty, that meant nothing. In 1975, the Biological Weapons Convention came into international force. An agreement signed by the major world powers explicitly banning the development, production, and stockpiling of biological weapons. Umbrella signed no such agreement, being a private corporation rather than a government, but the nations that did sign it were legally prohibited from pursuing exactly the kind of bioweapons research that Umbrella was conducting on their behalf. This did not stop them. Umbrella had been selling strands of the progenitor virus and its derivatives, the T virus among them, to the United States military as early as the 1970s, providing bioweapons research and capabilities that American government programs could not legally pursue on their own soil. The arrangement was mutually beneficial in a way that required no written acknowledgement. Umbrella received funding and political protection. The US military received bioweapons data and samples that technically had not been developed by any government agency. The fact that this arrangement was in direct violation of the international treaty that the United States had publicly committed to uphold did not appear to trouble either party. It is, in retrospect, one of the cleaner explanations for why the American government's response to Umbrella was as complicated and as slow as it was. The people in a position to stop Umbrella were also the people who had been quietly paying for its work. the progenitor problem that built the company. Before the T virus, before the G virus, before the hunters and the tyrants, and every other horror that Umbrella eventually produced, there was a fundamental scientific problem that the founders could not solve on their own. Progenitor could not be cultivated outside of its natural African environment. The flower required specific conditions, a particular soil chemistry, temperature range, humidity level, and biological context that simply could not be replicated in a standard laboratory. When the three founders returned from Africa with their samples, they found that the virus degraded almost immediately outside the controlled conditions in which it had evolved. This limitation was not a minor inconvenience. It was an existential problem for the entire project. Spencer's grand vision, a new humanity built on viral enhancement, with himself at the apex of a reordered world, was impossible as long as the source of that vision could only survive on one mountainside in West Africa. The founding of Umbrella Pharmaceuticals was, in one very specific sense, a scientific research and development project disguised as a multinational corporation. The pharmaceuticals, the consumer goods, the global subsidiaries, all of it was infrastructure built to generate the resources needed to eventually solve the cultivation problem and bring progenitor out of the mountain and into the controlled conditions where it could be manipulated, engineered, and eventually weaponized at scale. James Marcus and the leech that changed everything. James Marcus was, in many respects, the most gifted scientist among Umbrella's three founders. Where Spencer was a visionary and a strategist, and Ashford was a theorist, Marcus was the one who actually got into the laboratory and solved problems. He was the one who established the Umbrella Executive Training Center, a facility positioned as a school for future company managers, but functioning in reality as Marcus's private research domain, where he conducted the experiments that would eventually produce the T virus. For years, Marcus worked on the cultivation problem, trying to understand what made progenitor behave the way it did, what conditions allowed it to replicate, and how it might be adapted into something more controllable. His breakthrough came from an unlikely direction. Marcus had been experimenting with leeches. He was interested in the leech's remarkable biological resilience, its ability to survive in diverse conditions, to adapt to a range of hosts, and to process biological material in ways that most organisms could not. In 1977, Marcus introduced progenitor into leech tissue and discovered something remarkable. The two organisms were compatible in ways that opened entirely new possibilities. The resulting hybrid, which would come to be called the tyrant virus, or T virus, retained the mutagenic properties of progenitor, but was far more stable and far more transmissible. By 1978, the development focus had fully shifted toward this new direction. Rather than trying to produce a universally lethal pathogen, researchers now understood the T virus could instead mutate hosts to become physically altered, remaining active despite severe organ damage, a discovery that, in military terms, was arguably more useful than simple lethality. The zombie, as a concept, was born in that leech research at a hidden facility in the Arklay Mountains. How Marcus was rewarded for his discovery. After creating the T virus, the foundational technology that would eventually make Umbrella the most dangerous corporation in history, James Marcus spent the following decade refining his work, expanding his research at the training center, and growing increasingly confident in his own importance to the project. By the late 1980s, Marcus had developed a worldview that Spencer found deeply threatening. Marcus believed correctly that he was the indispensable core of Umbrella's bioweapons program. He had begun to speak openly of his belief that the corporation's resources should be directed according to his priorities, and there were indications that he was beginning to plan a move that would have shifted the balance of power within Umbrella away from Spencer's control. Spencer did not wait to find out how far Marcus intended to take this. In 1988, he ordered the Umbrella Security Service to carry out the assassination with Wesker and Birkin, two of Marcus's own most trusted protégés, reported to have been involved in directing and executing the operation. The USS team moved on the training center, and Marcus was killed. His research was seized. His credit for the creation of the T-virus was quietly transferred to Birkin, who was listed in subsequent Umbrella records as the T-virus's primary developer. Marcus was erased from the official history of his own greatest achievement, the resurrection that destroyed Umbrella. James Marcus did not stay dead. This is one of the stranger truths of Resident Evil's lore. Stranger in some ways than the zombies or the tyrants, or the genetically engineered monstrosities that populate the franchise's many laboratories. Marcus had spent years working with leeches. He had introduced progenitor into leech tissue and watched what happened. And the leeches, it turned out, had absorbed something of Marcus himself in the process of those experiments. Not in any mystical sense, but in a very specific biological one. The queen leech that Marcus had developed as a centerpiece of his research had spent years absorbing his cells, his memories, and ultimately something that functioned as a copy of his identity at a cellular level. When Marcus was killed, the queen leech survived. And over the following decade, while Umbrella expanded and consolidated, and the corporation's operations spread across the globe, the queen leech was regenerating its host. By 1998, Marcus emerged from the ruins of the training center, physically restored but deeply changed and consumed by a single purpose. He scattered the T-virus through the Arclay Research Center and the surrounding facilities. The outbreak that followed, the one that ultimately led to the events of the original Resident Evil game, was not an accident. It was a very deliberate act of revenge by a dead man who had found a way to return. What the T-virus actually did to people. The T-virus's effects on a human host are worth understanding in detail, because the common image of a zombie as a slow-moving, mindless creature misses a great deal of what the virus was actually designed, and what it accidentally achieved. When introduced to a human host, the T-virus did not simply kill and reanimate. It fundamentally reorganized the biology of the infected individual, shutting down higher cognitive functions, rewriting metabolism to favor aggression and hunger, and enabling survival through organ damage that would be immediately fatal in a healthy person. A T-virus-infected human retained enough biological function to move, to detect prey, and to transmit the infection through fluid contact, bites, scratches, broken skin, while losing virtually all of the cognitive and social functions that define them as human. Umbrella's scientists understood this distinction clearly. The zombification outcome was, from a military standpoint, actually useful. A population infected with the T-virus would turn on itself, tearing apart civilian infrastructure and overwhelming any defense force attempting to respond. However, the virus presented a critical limitation that Spencer found unacceptable. Approximately 10% of any human population possessed a natural immunity to T-virus infection. They could not be zombified. They could potentially fight back. This 10% problem drove an enormous amount of subsequent research, ultimately leading to the creation of the Hunter, a bioweapon specifically engineered to hunt down and eliminate the survivors. Dogs in the dark. Among the earliest successful bioorganic weapons that Umbrella produced, the Cerberus was in some ways the most straightforwardly horrifying, because it began with something familiar. Umbrella researchers took German shepherd dogs, animals that humans have bred for centuries to be loyal, protective, and responsive to human command, and infected them with the T virus. The results transformed the dogs into Cerberus units, creatures that retain the muscle memory and territorial instincts of a trained animal, but lost all capacity for obedience, loyalty, or restraint. They moved faster than a healthy human could run. They responded to sound and motion with immediate lethal aggression. They were difficult to put down because the T virus gave them a resilience to injury that normal dogs did not possess. The Cerberus program was not Umbrella's most sophisticated work. It did not require the genetic engineering or the complex surgical procedures that the later Tyrant project demanded. But it demonstrated something important, that the T virus was an adaptable tool, capable of transforming existing species into weapons with relatively modest modification. The Cerberus units that appeared in the Arklay Mountains in 1998, attacking hikers and rural residents in the weeks before the full outbreak, were among the first signs that something had gone catastrophically wrong inside Umbrella's facilities. They were also, for many people, the last sign they ever saw. Silk and venom, the web spinner. Before Umbrella achieved the biological complexity required to produce a tyrant or even a functional hunter, it produced simpler creatures, things that required fewer genetic modifications, that leveraged existing biological templates in more direct ways, and that served as proof of concept for the broader program. The web spinner was one of these early experiments. At its core, it was a spider, a wolf spider specifically, that had been infected with the T virus and exposed to additional mutagenic compounds that accelerated and distorted its growth. The T virus's capacity to dramatically increase the mass and metabolic rate of infected organisms turned a creature that might naturally grow to a few centimeters into something the size of a small dog, with proportionally enhanced venom, enhanced aggression, and a rate of reproduction that made containment challenging in anything but a tightly controlled environment. The web spinner appeared in the Arklay laboratory and in the Spencer mansion during the events of the original game, encountered by STARS members who had no framework for understanding what they were looking at. It was not particularly sophisticated as a bioweapon. It could not follow complex orders or target specific individuals, but it demonstrated that the T virus could be used to produce dangerous organisms from almost any biological starting point, which was precisely what Umbrella's researchers needed to know before they began work on something more ambitious. The Hunter, where human and reptile became one. The 10% immunity problem haunted Umbrella's military projections for years. A biological weapon that could be neutralized by 1 in 10 of any target population was not a reliable weapon, and reliability was what Umbrella's military clients paid for. The solution that Birkin and his team at the Arklay laboratory eventually developed was not to fix the T virus itself, but to create a separate creature specifically designed to address the gap. In 1981, the Hunter project produced its first successful specimen. The process was extraordinary in its clinical precision. A human egg was fertilized, and during the earliest stages of cellular development, reptilian DNA was introduced, using the T virus as a biological bonding agent. The T virus, which Umbrella's researchers had discovered possessed a remarkable capacity for facilitating genetic recombination between different species. essentially stitched the two genomes together into a single viable organism. What emerged from this process, after the necessary development period and subsequent infection with a mature T-virus strain, was something that occupied a strange middle space between human and reptilian. The hunter had the bipedal structure of a human being, the scaled hide and biochemistry of a reptile, and the behavioral programming of a weapon. It was fast. It was nearly impossible to stop with conventional weapons, and it had been engineered specifically to hunt the survivors of a T-virus outbreak, the 10% who would otherwise walk away. All hunter specimens were female, cloned from a very small number of original specimens, and were engineered to be incapable of reproduction to prevent uncontrolled breeding in deployment zones. The plants that came alive. One of the quieter horrors of the Arklay laboratory was the botanical wing, a section of the facility where Umbrella's researchers had been working on a class of bioorganic weapons derived from plant tissue. The ivy, as these organisms came to be known, were flowers and plants that had been grown in the presence of the T-virus over extended periods, exposed to mutagenic compounds that stimulated both rapid growth and the development of biological systems they should not have possessed. What emerged were ambulatory plant forms, organisms that retained the structure of flowering plants, but developed rudimentary locomotion, predatory instincts, and in some variants, a capacity to synthesize and deploy biochemical toxins from structures that resembled ordinary plant biology. The most advanced ivy specimens developed a secondary function. They could generate a poisonous gas from specialized organs, and certain variants were capable of producing a compound that, on contact with human tissue, initiated a rapid transformation consistent with T-virus infection. They were not intelligent. They had no communication, no coordinated behavior, no ability to adapt to changing tactical situations. But they did not need intelligence to be effective in the confined corridors of a sealed underground facility. They were biological landmines that could also pursue their targets, and they represented one of the more imaginative applications of T-virus technology, the transformation of something stationary and passive into something moving and lethal. The boy who joined at 16. William Birkin first walked through the doors of an Umbrella research facility when he was 15 years old. This is one of those details in the franchise's lore that deserves a moment's consideration, because the implications of it extend in multiple directions simultaneously. Birkin was recruited as a teenager, a brilliant, extraordinarily gifted teenager, but a teenager nonetheless, into an organization whose true purpose was bioweapons development for a eugenics program. He would have had no meaningful understanding of what he was actually participating in. He was given access to some of the most sophisticated viral research in the world, placed under the mentorship of James Marcus himself at the Umbrella Executive Training School in 1977, and introduced to a peer named Albert Wesker, with whom he would develop the closest thing either of them ever had to a genuine friendship. Birkin's talent was immediately apparent. He absorbed knowledge at a rate that alarmed and impressed his supervisors in equal measure. And by the time he was working at the Arklay laboratory, he had become one of the most productive researchers in Umbrella's history. But all of that productivity, all of that brilliance, had been shaped from its earliest stages by an organization that treated human beings as expendable raw material. Birkin was not a monster when he arrived. The question of what Umbrella made him and how long that process took is one of the more haunting threads in the franchise's moral architecture. Lisa Trevor, 30 years in the dark. Before William Birkin discovered the G virus, before any of the franchise's most famous outbreaks, There was a girl named Lisa Trevor. Her story is one of the most difficult in all of Resident Evil's lore, not because of the monsters it involves, but because of the very specific human cruelty at its center. Lisa Trevor was born in 1953, the daughter of George Trevor, the same architect Spencer had commissioned to build the Spencer Mansion, and his wife Jessica. In November 1967, the Trevor family were invited to the newly completed estate under false pretenses, ostensibly to celebrate the mansion's completion. Lisa and her mother arrived a few days before George, and that same night, Spencer's men had them taken to the underground laboratory. Lisa was approximately 14 years old at the time. She was injected with the B-type variation of the progenitor virus. Jessica, administered the A-type variant, did not adapt and died. Lisa's biology did something that Umbrella's researchers had not anticipated. She survived, and she continued to survive through decades of increasingly aggressive experimentation that should have killed her many times over. Over the following decades, while the world outside continued, while Raccoon City grew and changed, and the corporation expanded to every corner of the globe, Lisa remained in the Arclay laboratory, injected again and again with new experimental compounds as Umbrella's researchers attempted to understand what made her different. She was given additional progenitor strains. She was given the NE alpha parasite. She was given multiple additional viral agents whose effects on her body produced mutations that should have been fatal, but somehow were not. By 1998, Lisa Trevor had been in Umbrella's custody for 30 years. She was no longer entirely human. She wore a mask fashioned from the faces of researchers who had come too close. She wandered the corridors of the Spencer Mansion, searching for her mother, holding on to a memory that the decades of experimentation had left largely intact, even as everything else about her had been altered beyond recognition. The discovery made from her suffering. In 1978, William Birkin took over as the lead researcher responsible for Lisa Trevor's case. By this point, Lisa had been in Umbrella's custody for over a decade, and her biology had been so comprehensively altered by the various compounds injected into her that she had become something genuinely unprecedented, an organism that existed at the intersection of multiple progenitor strains, the NE alpha parasite, and additional mutagenic agents, all of which had been somehow absorbed and integrated into her cellular structure, rather than destroying it. Birkin's notable contribution was the decision to inject Lisa with the NE alpha parasite, a parasitic entity that Umbrella's European branch had been developing as part of a project to create intelligent BOWs. In every other test subject, the NE alpha experiment had been fatal within approximately 20 minutes, consistently and without exception. In Lisa, something different happened. The parasite encountered the progenitor variant that had been living and mutating within her body for years, and the interaction between the two, the NE alpha parasite meeting an already transformed progenitor strain, produced something that neither Birkin nor anyone else at Umbrella had anticipated. A new virus had emerged within Lisa's body, developed through continuous mutation of the original strain she had been given. Birkin named it the G virus, Golgotha, and the discovery that it represented a mutagenic agent capable of evolving its host, rather than simply destroying one, would consume the remainder of his professional life and ultimately end it. What the G virus actually was. The difference between the T virus and the G virus is not simply a matter of degree. They are, in a meaningful sense, philosophically opposed tools built from the same raw material. The T-virus was designed, or rather evolved through Umbrella's refinement, to weaken progenitors' properties down to something manageable. A pathogen that could infect humans and produce useful mutations without the near-universal lethality of progenitor in its raw form. The result was the zombie, technically alive, technically mobile, technically infectious, but fundamentally degraded, stripped of everything that made the host a person and left with the minimum biology required to function as a biological weapon. The G-virus did the opposite, where the T-virus aimed at the flaw, finding the lowest viable expression of progenitor in a human host. The G-virus aimed at the ceiling. It was designed, in the sense that it had emerged from biological conditions that Birkin then spent years deliberately recreating and refining, to tap into the full evolutionary potential of progenitor. A G-virus host did not degrade. It grew. It added. It produced new biological structures, new limbs, new sensory organs, entirely new tissue configurations that had no equivalent in any naturally occurring organism. The G-virus kept its host alive through a process of continuous, explosive mutation, healing every wound by growing around it, replacing lost function with entirely new biology. The end state of full G-virus infection was something so far removed from the original organism that calling it by the same name felt almost meaningless. The underground lab beneath the city, the Nest, Umbrella's underground laboratory, was one of the corporation's most sophisticated facilities, built in 1991 within limestone deposits in the Arklay Mountains, directly beneath the Umbrella chemical plant. That plant served as the above-ground facade. While the Nest is often described informally as being beneath Raccoon City, the wiki is precise. It sat in the Arklay Mountains outskirts, connected to the city by private underground cable car, by rail, and by the sewer network, close enough that contamination could flow directly into the city's water system, but not technically within the city limits itself. Birkin and his wife Annette were transferred to Nest to oversee the G-virus project, which required a larger, more secure facility than the Arklay laboratory could provide. The Umbrella chemical plant above gave the laboratory beneath it a level of concealment that no obviously isolated mountain location could have maintained. The facility included everything a major research operation required: laboratory spaces, testing areas, a power generation system, housing for researchers who needed to be close to their work, and the sophisticated biological containment systems required to handle active G-virus and T-virus samples simultaneously. Birkin had bribed Police Chief Brian Irons specifically to maintain the legal environment that allowed Nest to operate without interference, ensuring that any investigation that got too close to Umbrella's underground operations would be quietly redirected before it could do damage. The Nest facility was also connected to Raccoon City's sewer network in ways that would ultimately prove catastrophic, providing a pathway through which the virus could escape containment and reach the city's water supply. The man who was paid to look away, Brian Irons, was the chief of police of Raccoon City, and he was one of the more disturbing figures in Umbrella's network of collaborators precisely because of how thoroughly human his corruption was. He was not a corporate functionary or a scientist with a detached relationship to suffering. He was an active predator who had a history of violent behavior against women that was, by 1998, apparently well known enough that characters in the games describe it as something people were aware of. Umbrella kept him in place, not despite this knowledge, but because of it. His background gave them leverage over him that they could use at any time, and his unpredictability made him, paradoxically, reliable in the specific way that Umbrella needed, Irons did what he was paid to do. He blocked investigations, buried evidence, redirected resources away from anything that might have exposed Umbrella's operations in Raccoon City. He was not a sophisticated collaborator. He was a blunt instrument, a corrupt official whose personal vices made him easy to control and whose institutional authority made him useful. When the outbreak began in September 1998, Irons attempted to manage the situation in ways that served his arrangement with Umbrella rather than the population of the city he was supposed to protect. He kidnapped the mayor's daughter during the chaos. He barricaded sections of the police station and withheld information from survivors. He was eventually killed by Birkin during one of the G-Mutants' rampages through the facility. A fitting end, in its way, for a man whose usefulness to Umbrella had depended entirely on a city that no longer existed. The mayor's plan that hid the truth. Mayor Michael Warren was, in the years before 1998, a celebrated politician whose Bright Raccoon 21 urban renewal initiative had transformed his city's self-image from a modest, Midwestern town into an aspirational community with a bright economic future. The plan included the renovation of City Hall, the construction of a state-of-the-art hospital, the expansion of Raccoon University, and significant investment in the city's infrastructure. All of it funded in substantial part by Umbrella Corporation. Warren was not, by available accounts, aware of the full extent of what Umbrella was doing beneath his city, but he was aware that the money for his renewal project came from a company that required a level of accommodation that legitimate pharmaceutical corporations typically did not. The arrangement between Warren and Umbrella was not a simple bribe. It was a structural dependency. Umbrella's investment in Raccoon City's public face was genuine and ongoing, and it gave the corporation a degree of civic legitimacy that made any serious investigation into its activities politically complicated. Who investigates the company that built your hospital and renovated your city hall? When the outbreak began, the mayor fled the city. He left his daughter behind. The man who had spent years presenting himself as the face of Raccoon City's bright future did not stay to face the consequences of the relationship he had helped sustain. STARS, the watchdogs who worked for the Fox, STARS, the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, was Raccoon City's elite law enforcement unit, and it was funded by Umbrella Corporation. This detail, encountered early in the Resident Evil franchise and easy to pass over in the context of the game's initial mystery, becomes considerably more disturbing when you sit with it for a moment. The corporation that was running an illegal bioweapons program beneath the city paid to establish and maintain the most capable investigative unit in the city's police department. The reasons for this are not entirely cynical. A city with significant Umbrella presence naturally attracted certain kinds of crime, and Umbrella had some genuine interest in maintaining a level of local order that did not interfere with its operations. But Umbrella had also specifically placed Albert Wesker, one of its own agents, inside STARS as the unit's captain. Wesker's role within STARS was to ensure that if the unit ever came close to discovering anything it should not discover, Umbrella would have advance warning and the ability to redirect the investigation. When STARS was eventually sent to investigate the murders in the Arklay Mountains, murders caused by escaped bows from the mansion's laboratory, Wesker's orders from Umbrella were to allow his own teammates to die. The survivors were intended to serve as combat data. Their performance against Umbrella's various BOWs recorded and analyzed for weapons development purposes. STARS was Umbrella's unwitting quality assurance department for its most dangerous products. The September days that changed everything. The collapse of Raccoon City in September 1998 was not a sudden event. It was the accumulation of decisions and consequences that had been building for years, triggered by a very specific chain of events that began on the night of September 22nd. Birkin, having spent weeks preparing to defect to the US military with his G virus samples, was ambushed in the Nest laboratory by an Umbrella Security Service team sent to retrieve the virus by force. Hunk, the USS Alpha team leader, and his unit shot Birkin multiple times during the recovery operation, taking the attaché case of viral samples. What the USS team did not realize was that Birkin had kept one additional sample on his person. Dying on the floor of his laboratory, bleeding out from multiple gunshot wounds, Birkin reached into his lab coat and withdrew a syringe of G virus and injected it into himself. Within minutes, the G virus had stabilized his injuries by initiating the cascade of mutations that would transform him into one of the franchise's most physically powerful antagonists. The G mutant formerly known as William Birkin then pursued the USS team into the sewers, attacking them and destroying the case they had stolen, shattering the vials inside and exposing the sewer ecology to both G virus and T virus simultaneously. The rats in Raccoon City's sewers feasted on the contaminated materials. The rats then fled the sewers to the city's reservoir, and the contaminated water flowed into the drinking supply of approximately 100,000 people. G's children. A horror with a logic. The G virus's reproductive cycle was one of the most disturbing aspects of its design. Disturbing not because it was mindless, but because it followed its own coherent biological logic, twisted as that logic was. A G virus host, a sufficiently mutated individual who had survived the early stages of infection and entered a more advanced state of transformation, retained a biological imperative to propagate the G virus through a specific mechanism. The G mutant would attempt to implant embryos, living biological packages containing nascent G virus material, into human hosts by inserting them through the host's mouth, using tentacles that emerge from the mutant's transformed body. If the recipient had genetics sufficiently similar to the original G virus host, a blood relative most commonly, the embryo would integrate into the host biology and begin developing, eventually producing a second-generation G mutant that was theoretically more stable than the first. If the recipient did not have compatible genetics, the embryo would grow rapidly and catastrophically inside them, consuming their internal organs from within before bursting free as a rapidly developing creature that was not quite human and not quite monster, but something between the two. William Birkin spent his mutated final hours moving through Raccoon City in exactly this way, driven by a biological imperative that the virus had installed in place of the consciousness that had once made him a husband, a father, and a scientist. His daughter and the devil cure. Sherry Birkin was 12 years old when her father became something that could no longer recognize her. She had been living a childhood defined by parental absence. William and Annette Birkin were both so consumed by their research that Sherry spent much of her time effectively alone in Raccoon City, the daughter of two of the most important scientists at Umbrella's most critical facility, who had neither the time nor the disposition to be genuinely present parents. When the outbreak began, Annette sent Sherry to the police station, a decision that placed her directly in the path of events that would include an encounter with her fully mutated father. Birkin implanted a G virus embryo in his own daughter, during one of the frantic, chaotic sequences of that night. A moment that stands as one of the franchise's bleakest. A father who no longer knew his child, performing an act of G-virus propagation on the person he should have been protecting. Sherry's genetics, as his biological daughter, made her a compatible host. Without intervention, the embryo would have developed inside her and killed her from within. What saved her was a compound called Devil, a reagent that the scientists at Nest had been developing as an antiviral specifically calibrated to the G virus's chemistry. Claire Redfield and Annette Birkin worked together to obtain and administer the cure, removing the embryo's influence before it could progress beyond its earlier stages. Sherry Birkin survived. She would spend much of her adult life working for the US government as a federal agent, dedicating herself to the fight against bioterrorism, the shadow that her parents had cast over the world she had to grow up in. The children who were given a surname. Project W was Oswell Spencer's most personal project, and it was the most thoroughly hidden operation he ever ran. It was not listed in any of Umbrella's official archives. It was not stored on the UMF-013 supercomputer that held all of the corporation's research data. It was classified so deeply that the vast majority of Umbrella's own senior staff had no knowledge it existed. The project began from Spencer's conclusion that the eugenics vision he had built Umbrella to achieve could only be realized if the candidates who would carry the enhanced genome into the future shared his values, his worldview, his deep conviction that the species needed to be remade. Children could be shaped, adults could not. Spencer, or a trusted researcher known only as Dr. Wesker, who gave the project its name, began selecting children whose parents had made significant contributions to human civilization. The criteria were specific, carefully considered, and applied without any regard for the children's own wishes or those of their families. Some children were adopted through legitimate channels. Others were not. All of them were given the surname Wesker as a mark of their selection, enrolled in elite educational institutions, provided with the finest available resources, and quietly monitored for their entire lives by the Project W team. They grew up believing, in most cases, that they were simply very well-educated young people with unusually good opportunities, not knowing that their education, their environment, and the values being instilled in them had all been deliberately engineered to produce a specific kind of adult. The psychological manipulation built into their genes. Among the more unsettling details of Project W's documented methodology is a claim that has circulated in the franchise's community and been touched on in various non-primary sources, that the conditioning of the Wesker children may have gone deeper than education alone. The primary canon establishes clearly that Spencer chose children as candidates specifically because they could be educated and shaped to share his values. Children were more malleable than adults, their worldviews not yet fixed. The franchise also confirms through files in Resident Evil 5 that the children were given genetically programmed qualities as part of their preparation. Some readings of the available material suggest this could imply that the selection criteria and preparatory process incorporated elements tied to the progenitor-derived technology Umbrella was already using to shape biology at a cellular level. That the deference towards Spencer's approval observed in many of the Wesker children might reflect something built into their conditioning that went beyond what a standard elite education could produce. This remains an area where the franchise gives enough detail to raise the question without fully answering it. What the primary documentation does confirm without ambiguity is that Spencer selected children specifically because they could be shaped, that all of them were given the Wesker surname, that they were raised in environments designed to instill specific values, and that the majority of them grew up without any awareness that their lives had been engineered from the outside. Albert Wesker was one of them. The man who would eventually kill Spencer had been built from childhood to serve him. 13 subjects, 2 survivors. In the final phase of Project W, Spencer selected the 13 most promising candidates from among the Wesker children, the individuals whose academic records, psychological profiles, and biological markers suggested they had the highest probability of surviving what came next. Each of them was administered the progenitor virus in some form. Some were exposed through what was presented as a routine medical examination. Others were manipulated into receiving it under various pretexts. None of them were informed of what they were being given or what effect it was expected to have on them. The expected effect was transformation, the emergence of the enhanced physical and cognitive capabilities that Spencer had been working toward since the 1960s. The actual effect, in 11 of the 13 cases, was death. The progenitor virus, even in the modified forms that Umbrella had developed over 30 years of research, remained lethal to the overwhelming majority of human subjects. 11 of Spencer's carefully selected, meticulously prepared candidates died. 2 survived. Albert Wesker, subject 13, survived because of a specially developed viral variant, a strain calibrated specifically to his genetics and later called T. Wesker, that granted him superhuman physical abilities, reflexes that far exceeded the human range, and a regenerative capacity that functioned almost like biological immortality against conventional injury. Alex Wesker, subject 12, had survived a different version of the exposure but had contracted a terminal disease prior to infection that complicated the enhancement process in ways that prevented her from gaining the full capabilities the virus was designed to confer. The man with no equal, until the man who killed him. Albert Wesker emerged from Project W as something genuinely unprecedented in the franchise. A human being who had been successfully enhanced by the progenitor virus to a degree that placed him outside the normal range of human capability in almost every measurable way. His physical speed was demonstrably superhuman. He could deflect gunfire at close range, not because the bullets could not hurt him, but because his reflexes were fast enough to step aside. His strength was sufficient to punch through solid walls. His regenerative ability meant that injuries that would kill or permanently disable a normal human being healed within minutes. And underneath all of that, he remained the intellectually gifted, strategically sophisticated person that Project W's education system had produced. A scientist, a tactician, and a long-term planner who consistently operated multiple moves ahead of everyone around him. Wesker used these capabilities to betray Umbrella, defect to a rival organization, and eventually pursue his own version of Spencer's eugenics vision using the Ouroboros virus. He was killed in a volcano in 2009, brought down by Chris Redfield and Sheva Alomar. And even then, the sequence required launching missiles into lava to ensure the outcome. He had been, for the better part of a decade after Raccoon City, the most dangerous individual in a world full of very dangerous things. The survivor who chose a different path. Alex Wesker's story runs parallel to Albert's in its origins and diverges from it almost entirely in its execution. Both were products of Project W. Both survived the progenitor injection that killed 11 of their fellow subjects. But where Albert emerged from the experience with dramatic physical enhancement and a clear sense of purpose that he, would spend the rest of his life pursuing. Alex's situation was more complicated. She had contracted a terminal illness before the viral exposure, a disease that the injection could not override, and the enhancement she did receive was partial and unstable. Alex was also uniquely among the Wesker children, fully aware of Project W. She had developed a close relationship with Spencer over the years and was the one candidate he had taken into his confidence about the project's actual goals. This awareness gave her advantages and burdens that none of the other candidates had. She understood exactly what she was and what she had been made to be. She spent the years following Umbrella's collapse, pursuing her own project on a remote island, the T-Phobos program, which used a specialized viral variant to test human subjects for qualities that she deemed worthy of continued existence. She was ultimately pursuing the same goal Spencer had set out toward decades earlier, the selection of a better human. She had simply inherited his vision without inheriting his resources or his timeline. The project that never appeared in the archives. There is a detail in the lore of Project W that reflects something important about how Oswald Spencer thought about power and information. The project was classified so thoroughly that it did not appear in Umbrella's official archives at all. The UMF-013 computer, the supercomputer that stored all of Umbrella's accumulated research data, a repository representing decades of viral research, bioweapon development, and corporate intelligence, contained no record of Project W. Spencer had ensured this specifically. His notes on the project were kept separately, and when Raccoon City was destroyed, he acknowledged that even those notes had been lost in the disaster. This was not an accident of circumstance. It was deliberate concealment, the kind of operational security that a man applies to something he does not intend to share with anyone, including his own corporation. Project W was Spencer's personal project in the most literal sense. It belonged to him the way his philosophy belonged to him, the way his vision of a reordered world belonged to him. Umbrella was a tool he had built to fund and enable it, but the project itself was kept outside the tool's reach. If Umbrella fell, Spencer intended for Project W to survive the fall, in the form of two enhanced human beings who carried his ideology and his genetic ambitions forward into whatever world came after. His vision, his tomb. In 2006, 8 years after the fall of Raccoon City, and 3 years after the official dissolution of Umbrella Corporation, Oswald E. Spencer was living in a private estate in Europe. Old, physically weakened, confined to a wheelchair, and watched over by a small number of remaining loyal guards. He had spent the years since Umbrella's collapse in a kind of extended twilight, aware that the project he had built, his life around, had failed in its specific corporate form, while simultaneously understanding that the ideology behind it had not died with the company. He had been seeking Albert Wesker, the one survivor of Project W, who had emerged with full enhancement and the capability to carry the vision forward. He found him, or allowed himself to be found, which amounts to the same thing. In the encounter that followed, Spencer revealed the full truth of Project W to Wesker, explaining the nature of his selection, his education, his enhancement, and the role Spencer had intended him to play. He told Wesker that he had been meant to be Spencer's chosen heir, the superhuman who would rule the new world that the progenitor virus was supposed to make possible. Wesker, who had spent the previous decade operating according to his own interpretation of Spencer's philosophy, received this information and then killed the man who delivered it. Spencer appears to have allowed this. There are interpretations in the law suggesting that Spencer confronted by the full scope of what his ambitions had destroyed, chose not to resist. That it was, in some sense, the ending he had been preparing himself for. He died in the estate, the last guardian of the original vision, killed by the creation he had never fully controlled. The Tyrant Project begins. In 1988, Umbrella's American branch launched the Tyrant Project with a specific objective: to produce a human-derived biological weapon of sufficient intelligence and physical capability to be deployed as a targeted weapon of war, something that could follow orders, pursue specific individuals or objectives, and operate in complex environments without the blind, indiscriminate aggression that characterize most lower-tier BOWs. The project's central challenge was the same problem that haunted all of Umbrella's human experimentation. The T-virus destroyed the cognitive function of most hosts, producing something useful for mass casualty scenarios, but useless for targeted operations. Tyrant production required a genetic configuration that existed in only a very small fraction of the human population. Individuals whose specific combination of genetic markers allowed the T-virus to dramatically enhance their physical capabilities while preserving enough of their higher brain function to accept and execute commands. Statistically, the Tyrant research team calculated the probability of any random individual possessing the correct genetic configuration was vanishingly small. This meant that producing a Tyrant required either extraordinary luck in the selection of test subjects, access to a very large pool of candidates, or both. Umbrella pursued the second option aggressively, which meant acquiring test subjects from orphanages, from the populations of the cities and facilities they controlled, from anywhere a sufficient supply of unwilling participants could be obtained without drawing attention. The heart grafted onto a monster, the first fully successful Tyrant, designated T-002 and housed in the lowest levels of the Arglay laboratory, represented the culmination of years of failed experiments and a significant number of subjects who had died producing the data needed to reach this point. The T-002 was large, far beyond normal human dimensions, with the physical configuration that had become the template for all subsequent Tyrant designs. Massively enhanced musculature, dulled cognitive functions sufficient to accept and retain simple targeting commands, and a biological durability that made it extraordinarily difficult to stop with conventional weapons. One of the specific modifications made to the T-002 during its development was the surgical grafting of a large animal heart directly onto its right chest. A dramatic intervention necessitated by the cardiovascular demands of a body that had been pushed so far beyond normal human physiology that the original heart could no longer supply adequate circulation. This externally visible heart, pulsing through the creature's skin, would become one of the most iconic visual elements of the franchise's early enemy design. And it represented something important about how Tyrant production actually worked. It was not simply a matter of infecting a subject with the T-virus. It required extensive surgical intervention, biological engineering, and the kind of hands-on modification that turned each successful Tyrant into a unique, individually crafted weapon, rather than a mass-produced unit. Mr. X, the face of mass production. Everything the T-002 represented in terms of craft, uniqueness, and individual engineering was eventually distilled into something that could be replicated. The T-103 Tyrant, known in Raccoon City as Mr. X, was Umbrella's first mass-produced Tyrant model, and its existence represented a significant shift in the corporation's approach to bioweapons development. Where the T-002 had been a singular achievement, that required years of refinement. The T-103 was designed from the beginning to be manufacturable at scale, with enough standardization in its genetic parameters that multiple identical specimens could be produced from the same cloning process at a facility specifically constructed for the purpose on an island called Sheena Island. The T-103 was visually distinctive, taller and broader than an ordinary human, wearing a long coat designed to help it blend into civilian environments before deployment, capable of sustained pursuit across variable terrain, and possessed of sufficient physical intelligence to track a target through a complex building and to adapt its approach when direct confrontation was blocked. Mr. X was deployed to Raccoon City specifically to eliminate survivors at the police station, to ensure that no one who might have recovered evidence of Umbrella's activities would live to present it. The Sheena Island facility where T-103 units were being mass-produced was eventually destroyed by a US government agent named Ark Thompson, eliminating Umbrella's primary Tyrant manufacturing capability at a critical moment. The limiter inside every Tyrant. Among the more quietly significant pieces of Umbrella's Tyrant engineering was the power limiter, a device implanted in each Tyrant during its production that served a specific and important function. It prevented the creature from undergoing the uncontrolled further mutations that the T-virus would otherwise naturally continue to drive. Left completely unchecked, the T-virus's mutagenic pressure on a Tyrant host would not stabilize at the enhanced human form that made Tyrants useful as weapons. It would continue pushing the host toward further transformations, increasing mass, proliferating new biological structures, generating the kind of dramatic anatomical changes that produced creatures useful for shock effect but far less useful for following tactical orders. The power limiter kept the Tyrant in the specific biological state where it was most functionally valuable. The consequence of this engineering choice was that when a Tyrant sustained sufficient damage, the limiter would fail, and the creature would begin the rapid, uncontrolled mutation into what researchers called the super Tyrant state. A Tyrant losing its limiter was not gaining power in a controlled sense. It was losing the one mechanism that kept it functional as a deployed weapon and entering a state of biological emergency that made it more dangerous, but also far less directional. The Super Tyrant forms encountered in various Resident Evil games represent what Umbrella's weapons did when they stopped working as intended. The parasite that replaced a brain. The Nemesis project was developed by Umbrella's European branch during the late 1980s as an alternative approach to the intelligence problem that defined the Tyrant project, where the American branch was attempting to select for the specific genetic configuration that allowed a Tyrant host to retain enough cognitive function to follow orders. The European researchers were pursuing a different solution. What if the host's cognitive function didn't need to be preserved, because you could replace it with something that worked better? The NE alpha parasite was engineered to be a synthetic biological brain, a parasitic organism capable of integrating into the nervous system of a Tyrant host and providing the intelligence and command reception capabilities that the host's own T-virus degraded nervous system could not sustain. The parasite would essentially serve as a transplanted cognitive layer, keeping the Tyrant's body functioning and its physical capabilities intact, while the parasite provided the processing required to interpret and execute commands. In practice, the most successful outcome of this research was the Nemesis T-type, a T-103 Tyrant whose original brain had been replaced with a fully mature NE alpha parasite, producing a creature of genuinely frightening tactical capability. The Nemesis could use weapons, It could operate across extended pursuit scenarios that required sustained adaptation to a changing environment. It could receive and prioritize complex targeting instructions. And it had been given a specific mission: find the surviving members of STARS and eliminate them. Hunt the witnesses. The decision to deploy the Nemesis T-type to Raccoon City in September 1998 was not primarily about containing the outbreak. It was about eliminating specific people who had specific knowledge. The surviving members of STARS: Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, Rebecca Chambers, had all been present at the Spencer Mansion in the weeks before the Raccoon City outbreak. They had seen the laboratory beneath the mansion. They had encountered the T-002 Tyrant. They had gathered evidence of Umbrella's bioweapons program and had been actively attempting to present that evidence to law enforcement and government bodies for months. They were witnesses, and Umbrella had decided that witnesses needed to be eliminated. The Nemesis was sent into Raccoon City with a targeting list that included every known surviving STARS member, with Jill Valentine as its primary pursuit objective during the events of Resident Evil 3. It moved through the city's collapsing infrastructure with a precision and persistence that nothing else in the outbreak possessed, not simply attacking whatever human beings it encountered, but actively seeking out specific people in specific locations. It destroyed a police helicopter attempting to evacuate survivors. It pursued Valentine across multiple city districts and through multiple encounters, each time absorbing damage that would have destroyed any less engineered organism and continuing. It was simultaneously a weapon of targeted assassination and a live combat data collection exercise, and it served both purposes until Jill Valentine ultimately brought it down. The AI that piloted a Titan. While the Nemesis project was Europe's answer to the Tyrant's intelligence problem, and the American branch was pursuing genetic selection, a third approach emerged in the form of the Talos project, a proposal from Umbrella USA to address the cognitive limitations of Tyrant hosts, not by replacing the brain with a parasite or finding a host with enough natural resilience to preserve higher function, but by bypassing the biological brain entirely. The T-Alos project, named for the mechanical giant of Greek myth, aimed to produce a tyrant whose physical capabilities were controlled by a sophisticated artificial intelligence, rather than by any organic cognitive system. The tyrant body would serve as a biological chassis, enormously powerful, difficult to destroy, capable of generating the mutations and enhancements that made tyrants valuable, while the actual decision-making was handled by a computer system integrated directly into the organism's nervous system. The T-Alos was the centerpiece of Umbrella's final operational facility, the Caucasus Laboratory, commanded by Colonel Sergei Vladimir, as a last-ditch demonstration of Umbrella's remaining capabilities. It was destroyed by Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine in 2003, during the operation that represented the final military confrontation with what remained of Umbrella as an active organization. Its destruction, alongside Wesker's theft of the UMF-013 data, and the subsequent exposure of the corporation's history to the US government, effectively ended Umbrella Corporation as a functioning entity. The bodyguard built to look human. Among the more unsettling applications of the T-103 Tyrant template was the Yvonne variant, a series of T-103 modifications specifically developed to function as personal protection for high-value Umbrella executives. The Yvonne models were distinguished from standard T-103 units by a dramatically enhanced capacity for human mimicry, not in appearance exactly, but in the ability to integrate into environments where other humans were present without triggering immediate alarm responses. They were taller than most humans and considerably broader, which made them impossible to pass off as ordinary people in any close-range encounter. But they were able to move with enough controlled deliberateness to operate as security personnel in the corridors of umbrella facilities without the constant, restless, predatory movement that characterized other Tyrant variants. At least 2 Ivan units were produced, serving as personal bodyguards for Sergei Vladimir, a man who clearly trusted mechanical loyalty over human loyalty, and had reason to give them the frequency with which Umbrella's human employees chose to betray the corporation in its final years. The Ivan units were not subtle creations, but within the very specific context of an umbrella, facility staffed by people who understood what they were working alongside, they served their function. They were loyal in the way that purpose-built biological machines are loyal. Completely, without negotiation, without the capacity for the kind of second-guessing and self-interest that made human employees such an unpredictable resource. The missile that ended a city. On October 1st, 1998, the United States government authorized and executed a thermonuclear missile strike on Raccoon City, what the franchise calls the Raccoon City Destruction Incident. The official justification was containment. The T-virus outbreak had progressed beyond the point where any conventional response could prevent it from spreading beyond the city's boundaries, and the only viable option was the complete destruction of the infected zone. This was, in the narrowest technical sense, accurate. The outbreak had consumed the city's population. Conventional military forces had withdrawn to perimeter blockades after suffering significant casualties. The city was lost, but the strike was not simply a public health measure. It was also the single most effective piece of evidence destruction that Umbrella had ever managed to arrange. And there is considerable ambiguity in the law about how much of the decision was driven by containment logic and how much by the interest certain powerful parties had in ensuring that Raccoon City's buried secrets stayed buried. Everything in the underground Nest laboratory, the G-virus research, the T-virus development records, the physical evidence of decades of illegal experimentation on human subjects, was destroyed in the strike. What survived the destruction did so because people had carried it out of the city before the decision was executed. The city itself, where approximately 100,000 people had been living their lives 3 weeks earlier, became ruins. The soldiers sent to die, the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service was, in its official description, a private military organization employed by Umbrella Corporation to neutralize biological threats and extract personnel from containment situations. In practice, the UBCS was something considerably darker. It was recruited primarily from the wreckage of the Cold War. Mercenaries, nationalist fighters, and soldiers from the disbanded armies of Warsaw Pact states who found themselves without employment or legal standing after the Soviet Union collapsed. Umbrella offered them contracts, salaries, and the kind of institutional anonymity that men with complicated legal histories found appealing. What Umbrella did not make explicit in those contracts was how their deployment in biological outbreak scenarios was expected to function. When the UBCS was sent into Raccoon City in late September 1998, with deployment orders framed as a civilian evacuation mission, the corporation was fully aware that the city was lost. The evacuation framing was not entirely dishonest. Individual UBCS members did attempt to help survivors in some cases, but the strategic purpose of their deployment was not primarily to save people. It was to place a body of trained soldiers inside an active outbreak zone so that their performance against the infected population and against Umbrella's BOWs could be observed, recorded, and analyzed. They were sent into Raccoon City to generate combat data. Most of them did not come out. What the government knew and when. The relationship between the United States government and the Umbrella Corporation was one of the franchise's most carefully maintained ambiguities, and for good reason. The full implications of it were not something that either party had an interest in making explicit. The wiki confirms that Umbrella entered a secret agreement with the United States military to produce biological weaponry, and that this relationship formed part of Umbrella's early funding and protection. This much is documented in the franchise's primary sources. What we can reasonably infer from the shape of the government's subsequent response to Umbrella, the slow pace of investigation, the legal complexity of the Raccoon trials, the managed way in which the city's destruction was framed publicly, is that those institutional relationships created an inherent structural reluctance in exactly the bodies that should have been most motivated to act. Whether specific individuals in the government knowingly allowed the Raccoon City disaster to unfold in a way that protected shared interests, or whether the delay was simply the ordinary inertia of bureaucratic systems protecting arrangements that nobody wanted to formally examine, is something the franchise deliberately leaves open. The legal process that eventually brought Umbrella down did not begin because the government suddenly discovered what the corporation had been doing. It began because enough evidence had accumulated in enough places through the efforts of enough survivors and investigators that the cover could no longer hold. The trial that bankrupted an empire. The Raccoon trials were not a single legal proceeding, but a series of connected cases collectively referred to under that name, centering on Umbrella USA's liability for the 1998 Raccoon City destruction incident. The legal architecture of these proceedings was complex, establishing corporate liability for a biological disaster of that scale required navigating jurisdictional questions, classified evidence, and the deliberate obstruction of a corporation that had spent decades cultivating relationships with the institutions that were now attempting to prosecute it. By 2003, the cases had progressed to the point where a verdict was rendered finding Umbrella USA liable for compensation related to the incident. The financial exposure that verdict represented was catastrophic. Umbrella had already been hemorrhaging resources since 1998. Facilities destroyed, personnel lost, stock value collapsing as the corporation's involvement in the disaster became increasingly public knowledge. The verdict did not merely add to those losses, it finalized them. Umbrella was found bankrupt. Its subsidiaries were dissolved. Its physical assets were seized. The corporation that had operated for 35 years as one of the most powerful entities on Earth ceased to exist in any formal legal sense within a year of the verdict. What remained was the research, the viral data, the BOW specifications, the accumulated knowledge of 3 decades of bioweapons development, scattered across former employees, rival organizations, and black markets that would sustain the age of bioterrorism for years afterward. Survivors and their lasting stigma. The destruction of Raccoon City did not end with the missile strike. For the people who survived, who had escaped the city in the weeks of chaos before the final strike, who had been evacuated through one of the dwindling exit points before the military sealed the perimeter, who had fled through sewers and service tunnels and routes that no official evacuation plan had anticipated. The aftermath was its own kind of horror. By 2017, nearly 2 decades after the event, survivors and their descendants were documented as still facing significant social discrimination within the United States. The stigma attached to Raccoon City, the association between its survivors, and an event that the government had spent years framing in terms that emphasize biological contamination rather than corporate crime, manifested in employment discrimination, social exclusion, and a persistent cultural narrative that treated the people who had lived through the city's collapse as somehow tainted by what had happened to them. The city itself remained a major international hub for a secret bioweapons manufacturing and smuggling operation run by an organization called the Connections, who had quietly moved into the ruins in the years after the strike and established infrastructure in the crater that official surveys had declared uninhabitable. The ruins of Raccoon City were, in this sense, still producing exactly the kind of harm that Umbrella's original operations had initiated, just through different hands. The Earl who cloned his own ancestor, Dr. Alexander Ashford, the 6th Earl Ashford, inherited a family name that had once been synonymous with Umbrella's founding and had since become a source of acute professional embarrassment. Edward Ashford, his father and one of Umbrella's 3 original founders, had died early, leaving the Ashford family's position within the corporation in an increasingly precarious state. The Birkins and their G-virus research dominated Umbrella USA. Spencer controlled the corporation's strategic direction absolutely. The Ashford family's Antarctic branch had produced nothing of comparable significance, and Alexander was acutely aware that if his family was to matter within Umbrella's hierarchy, it would require something extraordinary. What he created was not extraordinary in the way he intended. Project Code. Veronica was Alexander's attempt to restore his family's scientific reputation through genetic engineering, specifically by cloning the DNA of the Ashford family's most celebrated ancestor, the matriarch Veronica Ashford, whose intellectual capabilities had been legendary within the family's history. Alexander obtained genetic material from Veronica's embalmed remains, isolated what he believed to be the gene sequences responsible for her exceptional intelligence, combined them with additional genetic material, and used the resulting composite to produce 2 children through artificial insemination of a surrogate. The project worked better than he anticipated. One of the 2 children he created was, by any measurable standard, a genius of the first order. The other was not. And the genius, when she eventually discovered the truth of her origins, decided that her creator had earned exactly what her virus could do to him. The girl who graduated at 10, Alexia Ashford, was born in 1971, alongside her twin brother Alfred, and from her earliest documented years she displayed the kind of cognitive capability that made everyone around her profoundly uncomfortable. She graduated from a prestigious university at the age of 10, not because she had been pushed through an accelerated program or given special accommodations, but because she had simply mastered the material faster than the institutions delivering it could keep pace. By the time she was appointed as head researcher at Umbrella's Antarctic facility, she was 12. The isolation this created was not incidental. A child of her ability existed in a space that adults rarely occupied and that other children were entirely absent from, and the only person who seemed to understand or share her worldview was her twin brother Alfred, who admired her with an intensity that bordered on worship. Alexia's response to this isolation was not to seek connection with the world beyond her intellectual reach, but to conclude that the world beyond her intellectual reach was, by definition, beneath her. She referred to the rest of humanity as the ignorant masses. She described her own brother, when she thought clearly about it, as a loyal soldier ant. The ant metaphor was not casual. It was the central organizing image of everything she intended to do with her virus, to reshape the world into a colony structure with herself as its queen, a hierarchy as absolute and as natural in her view, as the one that governed the insect societies she had been studying since childhood. What she found. Inside an ant, Alexia's scientific breakthrough, the discovery that would eventually produce the T. veronica virus, came from an unexpected direction, even by umbrella standards. She had been investigating the social structure of ant colonies as a biological model for the kind of hierarchical control she envisioned for her eventual world order. And in the process of this research, she discovered something that her more conventionally focused colleagues had overlooked. Within the genome of a queen ant, she found traces of an ancient retrovirus. Not a modern pathogen, but something that had been embedded in the ant's genetic heritage for what appeared to be a very long time. The remnants of an infection so old that it had been absorbed into the host species' baseline biology. This ancient viral sequence had properties that interacted in interesting ways with the progenitor virus that was Umbrella's foundational research material. Alexia combined the two, the ancient ant queen retrovirus and the progenitor, and added sequences of plant DNA to fill gaps in the resulting genetic structure, producing a novel strain of the T virus that she named T. veronica, in honor of the ancestor whose DNA had given her life. The resulting virus was capable of something no other strain Umbrella had ever produced could reliably achieve. Under the right conditions, it preserved the cognitive function of its host. It did not destroy the brain. It transformed the host while keeping them aware and capable of commanding others who had been infected with lower-level doses of the same strain. The father she turned into a monster. The first human trial of the T. veronica virus was conducted in February 1983, when Alexia was 12 years old. The subject was her father, Alexander. She and Alfred had discovered, in a secret room within the Antarctic base, the full documentation of Project Code, Veronica. The records that explained exactly what they were and how they had come to exist. They learned that Alexander was not their biological father in any meaningful sense, but rather the architect of their creation, a man who had manufactured them as instruments of his own ambition and given them the name of an ancestor they had never met. Alexia's response was immediate and cold. She captured Alexander and injected him with T. veronica, using her own father as the first human trial of her life's work. Alexander had not been prepared for the injection the way Alexia would later conclude was necessary. He had no prior biological conditioning to ease the transition. The virus consumed his cognitive function rather than preserving it, driving him into a state of insane, suffering mutation that produced the creature his own children would name Nosferatu. A thing of elongated limbs and poisonous exhalations and inarticulate anguish, imprisoned in the depths of the Antarctic base, where it terrified the facility's workers with the sounds it made in the dark. Alexia observed the results carefully, took notes on what had gone wrong, and concluded that she understood now what the virus required of a host before it could be safely integrated. Patience. An enormous amount of patience. 15 years in ice. Having established what the T. veronica virus needed to integrate successfully with a human host, a period of extremely slow introduction, during which the host's immune system could gradually develop the antibodies and biological accommodations required to survive the virus's mutagenic demands without suffering the catastrophic cognitive destruction that had taken her father. Alexia reached a conclusion that was either the most rational decision a 12-year-old has ever made, or one of the most chilling. She would inject herself with T. Veronica, and then enter cryogenic suspension. The ultra-low temperatures of the cryogenic state would dramatically slow the virus's activity, reducing it to a pace at which her body could adapt over time without the destructive speed that had doomed Alexander. Her calculations predicted that 15 years would be sufficient. In December 1983, Alexia injected herself with T. Veronica, sealed herself into a cryogenic chamber in the deepest level of the Antarctic base, and left her brother Alfred responsible for maintaining the facility and carrying out her instructions until the day she woke. She was 12 years old when she went to sleep. She would be 27 when she woke up. In those 15 years, the T virus reached the world. Raccoon City rose and fell. Umbrella Corporation grew to its peak and began its collapse. And in the ice below a mountain in Antarctica, a 12-year-old's body slowly, over 15 years, learned to coexist with a virus she had created to make herself a queen. The brother left behind. Alfred Ashford did not inherit his sister's brilliance. He was smarter than most people, but within the context of his family, defined entirely by Alexia's extraordinary capability, he was adequate at best, a disappointment at worst, and he knew it. His role after Alexia's cryogenic suspension was to maintain the Antarctic base and the adjacent facility on Rockford Island, which Umbrella had converted into a combined training camp and prison complex, and to protect his sister's sleeping body until the 15 years were complete. The psychological weight of this assignment, standing guard over someone you worship, in the knowledge that your only value is as a placeholder for their eventual return, produced consequences that the franchise documents carefully. Alfred developed a dissociative personality disorder over the years of isolation, constructing and inhabiting a second identity modeled entirely on his absent sister. He dressed as Alexia. He spoke as Alexia. He made decisions as Alexia. He maintained the fiction of her presence within the facilities, living in a mansion replica built beneath the Antarctic base, staging the appearance of a second resident, until the fiction became indistinguishable from his actual experience of reality. By the time Claire Redfield arrived on Rockford Island in 1998, Alfred had been living inside this split for years, and the deterioration of his mental state had made the facility he administered into something that reflected his disorder at every level. What T. Veronica could do that nothing else could. The T. Veronica virus, when successfully integrated, which required the specific conditions that Alexia had mapped and that only she had survived, produced a range of capabilities that no other viral strain in Umbrella's catalogue could replicate. A successful T. Veronica host retained full cognitive function, unlike every T virus or G virus outcome that had preceded it. They also gained control over organisms infected with subordinate doses of the same virus, a biological command structure that functioned along the same hierarchical lines as an ant colony, where the queen's pheromonal signals directed the behavior of the colony's members not through any mystical mechanism, but through the chemistry of the virus itself. An infected host at a lower dose level developed an instinctive deference to any host carrying a dominant strain, a property encoded in the ancient ant queen viral sequences that Alexia had incorporated into her creation. Additionally, successful T. Veronica hosts developed flammable blood. The enzymatic reaction that the virus produced within the host's circulatory system caused their blood to spontaneously combust on contact with oxygen, a property that Alexia could deploy offensively, projecting flame from her own body in ways that made her simultaneously a biological weapons platform and a tactical threat to anyone who managed to wound her. The virus also integrated plant biology into the host in ways that produced hardened chitinous carapace structures, a living armor built from parenchyma tissue that grew beneath the skin and could resist conventional ballistic trauma. The weapon built to stop her. Among the stranger details of Alexia Ashford's story is the fact that the weapon ultimately used to kill her was built by her own father before she turned him into Nosferatu. Alexander Ashford, in the years before Alexia's experiment on him, had apparently anticipated that his creation might one day become a problem that conventional weapons could not address. He designed and built an experimental device called the linear launcher, a weapon that fired superheated plasma rather than conventional projectiles, capable of producing temperatures and energies that could destroy biological tissue too resilient for standard firearms to damage. The linear launcher was stored in the Antarctic base's armory, waiting in the facility that Alexander had built for the moment when someone would need to stop what Alexia had become. That moment arrived in 1998, when Alexia, freshly awakened from her 15-year cryogenic suspension, encountered Chris Redfield during the chaos of Wesker's attack on the facility. By the time Chris needed the linear launcher, Alexia had already moved through multiple stages of mutation, progressing from a human form with dramatically enhanced capabilities through a queen antadjacent biological form, then an insect mass that the ants in the facility's lower levels had been recruited into surrounding and protecting her, and finally, a dragonfly-like aerial form capable of sustained flight and projecting flame. Chris destroyed her with the weapon her own father had built for exactly this purpose. The secret police nobody knew about, the Umbrella Security Service and the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service were both, in their ways, visible. Their existence was known within the corporation. Their functions were documented in internal records, and their personnel were at least nominally aware of what organization they worked for. The monitors were different. The monitors were Umbrella's internal secret police, a surveillance unit established specifically to watch the corporation's own employees and report anything that suggested disloyalty, unauthorized information access, or planning that fell outside sanctioned parameters. They operated without official designation in most internal documentation. Employees who worked alongside them typically did not know that their colleague was a monitor. The information they gathered went directly to headquarters, bypassing normal reporting structures so that even senior management within individual facilities could not be certain whether their own staff included monitor operatives. The practical effect of this was a workplace culture within Umbrella's research facilities where trust between colleagues was structurally undermined. You could not know with certainty whether the person working at the bench next to you was recording your conversations. You could not organize informally against decisions you disagreed with without the possibility that the organization would learn about it before your plan had fully formed. This surveillance architecture was not incidental to how Umbrella maintained control over its own personnel. It was central to it. Soldiers built from criminals. The UBCS recruitment model was, in retrospect, an almost perfectly calibrated mechanism for producing a workforce that would do what it was told without asking too many questions about the broader context of its assignments. Former guerrilla fighters from the conflicts that had defined the developing world through the Cold War era. Nationalist soldiers from the armies of Warsaw Pact states whose governments had collapsed and who found themselves in a legal grey zone regarding their wartime actions. Veterans of internal conflicts whose particular skill sets made them difficult to employ through conventional channels. Umbrella offered these men regular income, institutional identity, and operational deployment, all of which they needed, in exchange for a flexibility regarding orders and contexts that conventional private military organizations typically would not have provided. The UBCS was not the corporate equivalent of a modern private military company with codes of conduct and legal compliance departments. It was a collection of men who had been specifically selected because their histories had demonstrated a capacity to operate in extreme environments without the kind of institutional accountability that might have constrained more conventionally recruited personnel. When they were deployed into Raccoon City and told the situation was a rescue operation, some of them genuinely tried to rescue people. Others understood, at some level, that the description didn't fully capture what was expected of them. Most of them died regardless. The unit that dissolved itself. Among the more operationally unusual of Umbrella's paramilitary assets was the Undertaker unit, a specialized anti-bow force whose defining characteristics set it apart from every other military organization the corporation maintained. The Undertaker unit was composed not of human soldiers but of specially trained bioorganic weapons, creatures that had been selected, modified, and conditioned specifically for counter-bow operations, meaning they were designed to fight and destroy other bulls rather than human targets. This made the unit useful in scenarios where conventional human soldiers would be outmatched by Umbrella's own creations. Situations where a BOW had escaped containment and conventional suppression methods had failed, or where Umbrella needed to demonstrate to a client that it could clean up its own disasters without requiring external assistance. The feature that gave the unit its name was the one that made it operationally unique. Upon death, the organisms composing the Undertaker unit were engineered to dissolve. Their biological material would break down rapidly after their vital functions ceased, leaving no recoverable remains. This meant that any deployment of the Undertaker unit left behind no physical evidence that could be examined to determine what type of creature had been involved. Umbrella could deploy these units in contexts where even the knowledge that BOWs had been present needed to be suppressed, because the units themselves would eliminate that particular category of evidence along with whatever they had been sent to deal with. The supercomputer that held everything, the UMF-013, was Umbrella's central data repository. A supercomputer system that stored the accumulated research, corporate intelligence, and operational records of the entire corporation, representing decades of viral development, BOW specification, personnel records, and the kind of institutional knowledge that takes generations of dedicated scientists to accumulate. In the final years of Umbrella's operation, as the corporation's physical facilities were being destroyed or abandoned one by one, and its personnel were being killed, arrested, or defecting to rival organizations, the UMF-013 became increasingly critical. It was the one thing that preserved Umbrella's intellectual legacy in a form that could theoretically be used to restart operations or transferred to another organization to continue the work. Sergei Vladimir, one of the corporation's most loyal remaining executives, was responsible for protecting the UMF-013 and overseeing its eventual disposition according to Spencer's instructions. Vladimir had the computer evacuated from the Arklay facility shortly before the outbreak and transported to the Caucasus laboratory in Russia, which served as Umbrella's last significant operational base in the corporation's final years. The UMF-013 was ultimately seized by Albert Wesker during his infiltration of the Caucasus laboratory in 2003, and the data it contained, all of Umbrella's research, was presented to the US government as evidence that completed the legal case against the corporation while simultaneously giving Wesker's new employers access to everything Umbrella had ever discovered.